Oslo, Norway, Saturday the 3rd of June, 1995. A woman staying in room 2805 at the Oslo Plaza Hotel in central Oslo had not responded to attempts by hotel staff to contact her. By this point, she had been staying at the hotel for 3 nights. A "Do Not Disturb" sign was hanging on the door, so hotel staff treated it as a non-response situation and attempted to contact her using the hotel's internal TV messaging system. This basically lets reception send text messages directly to a guest's TV screen, a method they had already used earlier during her stay. The system was used when guests were unresponsive, and the messages were asking her to contact reception. Those messages were logged as received and acknowledged from inside the room on more than one occasion, but no response ever came. No call came in to the front desk to request a little more time. Prior to her arrival, she contacted the hotel by phone and amended the original 2-night booking, extending her stay through to Sunday the 4th of June. By Saturday evening, after an extended length of time with no contact, hotel security was sent to the room. Later reporting mentioned that the hotel was understaffed at the time, which helps explain why the situation wasn't escalated sooner. Later that evening, when the security guard knocked on the door, a gunshot was heard from inside. Startled, the guard immediately left to alert senior hotel staff, and the police were contacted. When officers eventually arrived and entered the room, they found the woman. She was dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Inside the room, police thought they would find the typical things you'd expect: ID, travel documents, something that would explain who this woman was so that her loved ones could be informed. But there was nothing like that. There was no passport, no wallet, no driver's license, no personal paperwork of any kind. Nothing at all that could immediately tell investigators where she had come from, or why she was there, or where she might have been going next. Hotel records showed that the woman had checked in on Wednesday, 31st of May, 1995, under the name Jennifer Fairgate. She had provided a Belgian address in a town named Verlaine. There was also a second guest listed on the booking, a man named Louis Fairgate, but it seems he had never actually checked in with her. As mentioned, no passport, no driver's license, no documents to confirm identity were ever recovered from the room. Despite this, hotel records showed she had successfully checked into the 5-star hotel, stayed for several days, and even ordered room service, which was charged to the hotel room account. Yet, from what was later reported, this had all been done without providing a credit card or leaving any other traceable payment details behind, which is just very strange. For the investigators, this immediately stood out. What had first appeared to be a tragic but straightforward scene was now a scene with mounting unsettling questions. She had somehow entered and exited the system without leaving a trace. But how? How had she been able to check in at all? And who actually checked her in? It's an answer we looked for, but the information just isn't available. What is known is that the woman herself contacted the hotel some days before her arrival and amended the booking, telling staff that 2 people would now be arriving, and giving the name Louis Fairgate as a second guest. Later reporting suggests that reception staff did try to recall the check-in, but their memories didn't match. One believed she was alone, Another was certain she arrived with a man. The accounts conflicted and no clear answer emerged. When it comes to what was actually inside the room, things became even stranger once police took a closer look. Investigators documented a small suitcase which contained a limited selection of clothing, which of course isn't so strange in itself, but most of the items were for the upper body, just jackets and blouses. There were no trousers, skirts, or dresses found, and no spare underwear. And, just to add even further to the strangeness, all identifying clothing labels had been deliberately cut out. Clearly, this must have been done to make them harder to trace. But why? Beyond the clothing itself, there were other everyday items missing too. Police found no handbag, no keys, no toiletries or cosmetics. Nothing you would normally expect someone to have during a hotel stay. In fact, the only personal item recovered from the room was a bottle of men's cologne, and aside from a single 50 kroner note left as a tip, there was no other trace of money. One item that particularly stood out was the watch that she was wearing, a Citizen Aqualand diving watch, a model often closely associated with military and special forces use. Investigators later confirmed, through an inquiry involving Interpol and the manufacturer in Japan, that the watch had been produced in January 1992. Inside the watch were 3 batteries, all manufactured in late 1994. Markings inside suggested they had likely been replaced around March 1995, just a few months before her death, by a watchmaker identified only by the initial W. That watchmaker was never found, and the manufacturer could not determine where the watch had been purchased. Once again, a traceable detail appeared, and then led nowhere. The gun used was a Browning 9mm pistol, still in her hand. A total of 34 rounds of ammunition were reported, some loaded in the gun, others described as being found loose amongst her belongings. The serial number on the weapon had been deliberately and professionally removed, which made it impossible to trace it in the usual way. Forensic experts were able to recover parts of the serial number, but not enough to fully identify the weapon. Belgian authorities later confirmed it had been manufactured in the early 1990s, but beyond that, its trail ended. There was no goodbye note. There were no signs of a forced entry. No evidence that anyone else had been in the room with her at the moment of her death. The door was locked from inside, and the weapon was found at the scene. Based on these details, the fatal wound was determined to have been self-inflicted. Not long after, following the initial investigation, the case was closed. When forensic specialists later examined the scene more closely, some details stood out. There had been significant backspatter inside the room. Blood was found on the bed, the walls, even up toward the ceiling. But despite that, the autopsy report noted no backspatter, burn marks, or gunshot residue on either of her hands. Several forensic experts later described this as unusual. Not impossible, but unexpected. One noted that given the amount of blood present in the room, the absence of any traces on the hands holding the weapon was striking. Another said that while this didn't rule out the conclusion that she ended herself, it was enough to make him uncomfortable, and that he would have advised police to investigate further. So the case was closed, but closed with questions left to answer. For a start, Do you remember we mentioned the Belgian address she had provided when she checked in? When investigators later attempted to get in touch with whoever else might be living there, they discovered that while the town itself was real, the specific address she wrote down did not exist. Belgian police later confirmed that neither Jennifer nor Louis Fairgate could be linked to any real person. The phone number she provided also came close to being valid, but had the wrong area code. That raised another question. If the address wasn't real, then where had she actually come from? With no valid address and no form of ID, police were unable to trace where she had actually travelled from before arriving in Oslo, or what she had been doing in the days leading up to her stay at the hotel. Checks were made against missing persons databases, both in Norway and internationally. No match was found, and therefore there was no family to reach out to. All investigators were left with was the scene inside the room, and a woman who, on paper, appeared to have arrived in Oslo without a past, and died without a name. According to police statements reported in the papers at the time, once investigators examined the scene more closely, attention then turned to the weapon itself. It was noted that her thumb was resting on the trigger, with her fingers wrapped around the grip, and her hand lying against her chest. Investigators described this positioning as unusual, not impossible, but not typical. In other cases where people have made this tragic decision, they almost always grip the weapon differently. This didn't mean the scene was inconsistent with similar deaths, but it was enough to be recorded as an anomaly. Police later concluded that 2 shots had been fired inside the room, based on the physical evidence found at the scene. One which ended her life, and another which passed through the bed and lodged elsewhere in the room without hitting her. What makes this detail more puzzling is this. There were no reports of anyone hearing 2 gunshots, which raises a simple question. How do you end up with 2 shots recorded, but only one ever reported as heard? As investigators continued trying to piece together what little they could, their attention turned to something a little more subtle: the hotel's keycard records. Like most modern hotels, access to the room was logged electronically. Each time the door was unlocked using a keycard, a timestamp was recorded, though that system could only show when the door was opened, not whether anyone actually went inside. The records showed something a bit unusual. There were long gaps where the room wasn't accessed at all, extended periods where no keycard activity was recorded. In total, there was a stretch of roughly 20 hours with no recorded keycard activity linked to the room. Earlier in her stay, hotel staff later said the room appeared to have been empty at some point during this period. This was confirmed because hotel staff had entered the room during that period and found it unoccupied. That period spans the time between her last confirmed sighting on Friday night, June the 2nd, and the evening she was found on Saturday, June the 3rd. What we do know is how her final hours unfolded. On Friday 2nd of June, 1995, the night before she was found, hotel staff confirmed she was still alive. At around 8:30 p.m, room service was delivered to her room. The staff member who brought the food later recalled that the room appeared almost sterile, with very few personal belongings visible. When forensic tests were later carried out, partially digested food was found in her stomach. That detail raised questions, because it suggested the meal may have been eaten much later than when it was delivered. As previously mentioned, throughout Saturday up until that evening, Messages were repeatedly sent to her room via the hotel's TV system, asking her to contact reception. Each message was acknowledged, but she never appeared at the desk. When staff realised the Do Not Disturb sign had remained on the door for days, and that repeated messages had gone unanswered, security was finally sent to the room. Moments after the guard knocked, a gunshot was heard. Now, on its own, that isn't massively suspicious. People sometimes stay in their hotel rooms for long periods without coming and going. Someone could sleep, watch TV, order room service and not use their keycard again for hours. But in this case, it does raise questions. Did she remain inside the room that entire time? Or had she left the hotel at some point? And if so, when and how? There doesn't appear to be any record of her being seen leaving. Could she have gone to another room? Keycard systems only record when a card is used. They don't track a person's movements. They can't tell investigators whether someone stayed inside the room the whole time, left once and never returned, or exited the hotel and simply didn't use the keycard again. So the lack of activity didn't provide answers. It only highlighted how much of her time in Oslo remained unaccounted for. When you take everything else into consideration, the lack of ID and false address, the absence of anyone who could confirm her movements, that missing time does start to matter, because without those pieces, there was no reliable way to reconstruct where she had been or who she may have been with in the hours leading up to her death. As you know by now, the woman's death was ruled self-inflicted. There was no evidence strong enough to reopen the case, and no clear indication that anyone else had been involved. On paper, that should have been the end of it. But what never changed, and what still hasn't changed all these years later, is the fact that no one ever learned who she really was. The name she used, Jennifer Fairgate, led nowhere. The address she provided didn't exist. The second name on the booking was never confirmed. No identification, no family. No one to come forward and say, "That was my sister," or "That was my daughter." Despite checks against missing persons databases, both in Norway and internationally, no match was ever found. Years later, long after the investigation itself had been closed, authorities made one final attempt to answer the most basic question of all. Who was she? With her identity still unknown, permission was granted to exhume her body so DNA testing could be carried out. Not to reopen the case as a crime, but simply to try and put a name to the woman found in room 2805. DNA samples were successfully obtained and compared against the databases that were available at the time. Nothing came back. No confirmed match. No missing person linked to her profile. Even with DNA, her identity remained unknown, which means that while the manner of death was officially considered as resolved, the person herself sadly never was. But with the data now on file, there may be a day when that changes. The thought that someone could just arrive in a major city, stay in a 5-star hotel, live for days under a false name, and then die without leaving behind a single confirmed trace of who they really were, is what continues to linger. What could have happened in her life to lead her there? And if she did take her own life, what circumstances brought her to that point, and what led her to do it in a way that ensured she would remain unknown? Those are the questions that may never be answered. When a case reaches a dead end like this one, what's left isn't evidence, it's interpretation. The official conclusion is simple. A woman in crisis took her own life and chose anonymity over being remembered. That explanation doesn't offer resolution, it doesn't explain why, and it doesn't give anyone something concrete to hold on to. That discomfort is often where more dramatic ideas take root. In a long-form investigation published by the Norwegian newspaper VG, journalists reported that police and intelligence officials did consider the possibility that the woman may have been involved in some form of covert work. The article notes that the Oslo Plaza hotel had a history of hosting diplomats, intelligence officers, and sensitive meetings, particularly in the years following the Oslo Accords. According to former intelligence figures interviewed by VG, if someone involved in covert operations were to die abroad, it would not be unusual for no missing persons report to ever surface publicly. Families could be informed privately, and the death allowed to pass without official explanation. The article is clear that there is no evidence she was a spy, but it does explain why investigators could not completely rule the possibility out. All the anomalies within this case just feed that idea. But of course, there is no evidence that she was a spy. But would there be if she was? When faced with a story this incomplete, it's tempting for people to reach for an explanation that feels purposeful, something that helps make the mystery feel justified. Whether that says more about her life, or about our need to make sense of something so deeply sad, is something each person has to decide for themselves.